Hello, and welcome to the Spirit, Power, and Grace podcast, a podcast where we explore where the Holy Spirit is at work in the world today and why that matters in your life. My name is Andrew Thompson, and it's great to have you along. Today, I'm talking with two colleagues, Todd Lovell and Matthew Johnson. We're in ministry together in the city of Tulsa, and I'm excited to sit down with them today for our special Thanksgiving episode. Matthew and Todd, it's good to have you. So today we're going to be talking about what it is that we're thankful for. And I've used the entire special effects budget of Spirit, Power, and Grace to help us with that. Gentlemen, we're coming to the Thanksgiving holiday, which is a time traditionally when we gather together with our families, we eat turkey, lots of other good stuff, and talk about what it is that we're thankful for. So let me just throw that ball into your court. When you look back on your own lives, or perhaps on the spiritual landscape of our country over the past year, what are some of the things that particularly stick out to you that make you want to give thanks? Matthew, let's start with you.
Well, I think in the course of my own life, there have been several highlights of this year. Of course, our family made a transition this year to another ministry context, and the spiritual alignment that you get to work with has been so great. I think particularly of the encounter services that we have had and the opportunity to be able to pray for people. I love being able to do that. I love the Spirit and Truth team that came from Dayton, Ohio, that really encouraged us to not just do evangelism, but to do it in a way by way of asking people how that we can pray for them. I mean, I'm 46 years old. I've been a Christian since I was 15, and I don't think I have ever lived in a way in which I'm willing to ask people, strangers, complete strangers, how I can pray for them. Mm-hmm. And to be able to think about that and not do it with any anxiety or fear around it, but like excitement because of how Matt Reynolds and his team instructed our group of people who got to listen to them was fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to more Thanksgiving around that next year. By the time we hit Thanksgiving in 2024.
How often do you think about that, Matthew? When you're going out and about, how often do you think about that experience with Spirit and Truth team and what it was that they were actually encouraging us to do?
Yeah, not as often as I would like. I have one of these mindsets that is called object impermanence, which is a fancy way of saying out of sight, out of mind. So unless I have that red string tied around my finger, I sometimes forget that I can do things. I was teaching a prayer class last night, and I said one of the hardest things for me is to remember that I can ask God for help. My wife was listening to a prayer app on her phone the other night, and the guy praying asked God to help him to hear God. And I sat there and I went, oh, I can do that. And I never remember to. And so I was talking about that I'm trying to find ways to remind myself of that. And so I'm actually trying to find ways to remind myself that I have opportunities to ask people to pray for them. One of the easiest ways for that is whenever we're out at a restaurant and we have a server. That's the time that I remember the most to ask our server how we can pray for them. But I'm trying to remind myself or get into a habit where I remember that whenever I'm out and about to ask people for that.
So what you're saying, you and I have talked before about the possibility of doing a podcast episode on Robert Coleman's book, The Master Plan of Evangelism. And what you're saying reminds me of the way that book begins and ends. And there's that famous line in the beginning of it where Coleman says, his concern was not with programs to reach the multitudes, but with men whom the multitudes would follow. Men were to be his method of winning the world to God. And then you turn over, this is almost from the very end, not quite, but almost the very end of the book. He says, this is the problem of our methodology today. Well-intended ceremonies, programs, organizations, commissions, and crusades of human ingenuity are trying valiantly to do a job that can only be done by people and the power of the Holy Spirit. It's a powerful way to articulate it, but it also is very convicting.
Yeah.
Because I'm not a street evangelist by nature. I shy away from those types of things, but the world that we live in is changing.
It really is. And when I think of street evangelists, I think of the people who came to the University of Arkansas campus when I was a student and would hold up these big banners and yell at us and tell us why we were going to hell and things like that. And I never realized that I could actually be a street evangelist just by asking someone, how can I pray for you? It's an act of love and compassion in that, but it also kind of confronts them with this idea that there is a God who is listening to us and who cares about that person.
Yeah. Todd, let me turn to you. As you think about this year, what are some of the things that you look back on and really want to give thanks for?
Well, I think I've had a lot of opportunities to grow, not just this year, but the past several years. And I'm incredibly thankful for those. I think the word that comes to mind when I think about the past few years has been trust. I don't know that I've ever really had to trust God in a way that I've had to the past few years. And so, before I came to this ministry opportunity, I was doing church planting, and that was, I thought I trusted God before, but you start doing work like that, and the quote that you read from the end of that book, that totally resonates with me, because there's no way to really program your way out of a lot of that stuff. With church planting, it is just that one-on-one relationship building as best you can, and trusting that whatever seeds you're planting, God is going to give the increase and going to, bring a harvest from that. And you just wake up every morning and kind of step out and do the things that God's calling you to do, and then you have to really trust Him for the results. Something I talked to our team here about is, we can't always control the outcome, but we can control the input. We can control the things that we do. And that's something that I've had to learn personally the past few years. But even coming here, transitioning from the ministry context I was in to the one that I'm in now, that was an exercise in trust. Just
It was a huge shift, wasn't it?
Huge shift, a completely different context. In a basic sense, it was from one church to another, but in another sense, the two churches and the two contexts could not be more different. And so, trusting one that would be a good fit ministry wise and kind of personally, but then also trusting that, God's going to get my family over here, and God's going to support us, and there's a lot of trust, and I know all three of us have experienced that. Just having to kind of put it on the line and go, okay, we're doing this, and God, will you just kind of work out the details, because there's not really anything you can do to force that. You have to just kind of control the things that you can control and leave the rest up to God. And my prayer life has increased quite a bit on that. I feel a lot less pressure, which is strange. I'm thankful for the reminder that it's not up to me. That's just the kingdom of God will be here long after I'm gone, and it's been here long before I was ever born. So I am invited to participate in it, but it's not dependent on my creativity or my ingenuity or my leadership or any of that. It's an invitation to participate in those things faithfully and to the best of my ability, but it's not up to me. That the Spirit of God is going to work through our prayers and our actions and our words, and that's enough. That's enough.
Yeah. So one of the things I think for all three of us, it's impossible, and I don't want to get into the weeds on denominational politics or things of that nature too much, but it's also for the three of us, it's impossible to think about just the enormous shift and transition that we've been through in terms of moving out of a system into something that really feels different.
Yes.
And can you talk a little bit, and I'll let either one of y'all take that, talk a little bit about the way it feels. How does it feel different to be in the context that we're in versus what it was that we were in before?
Well, one of the things that I have mentioned when people ask me about that is, for the first time ever, I feel 100% free to do ministry. I don't have this specter hanging over me, this hate, as you will. That is always reminding me that there's some catastrophe on the horizon for the worshiping community and stuff like that. And I haven't given it a second thought. I just jump in with both feet and start caring for people, praying with people, leading people, reading the scriptures with people, and just not having that weight on me has been incredible.
You know, one of the things that we've been talking about in our own ministry context is the possibility of new initiatives. And we've talked about the possibility of what does theological training, a school for ministry look like? What does a center for spiritual formation? What would that look like? What does evangelism of our city look like? What does a new approach to young adult ministry look like? And I think there's a lot of possibilities around any number of those, combination of those things on the horizon for us. And I don't even know that my mind would have been allowed to think in those. It's like, I don't know if I would have allowed myself to think in those terms if we hadn't moved into what we had moved into.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking is, I think for me, in the system that we came from, there was a lot of attention paid to like, I don't mean to make it sound crass, but like territories. Like, oh, well, if you want to do anything here ministry wise, you really need to talk to that church and that pastor that's already there. And it's just like, I just feel like the mission field is wide open. And it's like, where do you see the kingdom breaking in, and how can you help kind of midwife that into existence? And it doesn't matter if it's whatever church it is in town, or maybe whatever church it is across the globe that we've been partnering with. If it's new initiatives, if there's kind of if we see the Spirit moving in a way, which I think we do with trends in theological education, particularly around clergy and laity in America, if we see certain trends and we want to try to address that, and we feel like the Spirit is stirring something in us, it's like, we don't have to worry about, well, yeah, we want to do that, but there's this other church across town that's already doing it, so we can't. Which I kind of felt, I don't know if that would ever have been said explicitly, but that's kind of operative in the back of your head, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah. Yeah. I come from a background in theological education. I taught for several years on a seminary faculty. And when I used to think about theological education, I used to do it with, kind of automatic mental reference to the institutional expectations of where I was working. Even beyond that, the Association of Theological Schools, which is the kind of national accrediting body. And there were just certain lanes that you had to stay in. And we've been talking a lot about theological education and spiritual formation over the past few months. And none of that pertains to us. None of those strictures, none of those guardrails. And it just opens up the possibility for creative thinking that just wasn't there before.
Well, and I don't think we can overlook the fact of the people that we are called to serve with in this place have the same mindset.
They do.
I mean, that's a huge piece of this, because I don't know that any of the conversations we've been having about stuff like that is necessarily unique. I think we've kind of always had conversations like that throughout the years, but I feel like with the place that we're at now, we can put legs to it. Like we actually have people that are excited to make that happen. And not that people before weren't, but I just, like you said, I just don't know that they had the cognitive framework to even imagine stuff like that.
Yeah.
Or to even see how it would work in the system that we happen to be in.
Yeah.
In thinking about all those accrediting and things like that as well, I wonder if the question, like, what is the purpose of theological education? Because I think the purpose when we were going through, and I'm not knocking theological schools here at all, but it was to infuse us with knowledge so that we could get past some gatekeepers in order to become ordained elders in a particular denomination. But the thing that excites me about the conversations we're having about a school of ministry is that the information is important, but the thing that the purpose of it is to equip people to actually go out into the community, into their jobs, into their neighborhoods, into the football stadiums or the gathering place here at Tulsa, and share Jesus Christ with people and lead them into relationship with Christ, disciple them, and help them to walk with Christ. Like to me, there's a much clearer purpose for what we're doing than merely hanging a degree on the wall and having a bishop lay hands on us for something.
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't necessarily want to put you on the spot, Andrew, but I kind of do also. Like you've lived in that world, like the academic, kind of the formalized theological school world. And so I think it's easy for Matthew and I to dream about that, because it's kind of like Matthew was saying, like it's kind of something that, I don't know, I kind of wish I had. But like you actually lived in that world. And so is it exciting for you to think of that taking its form in the modern day, or do you have your own mental hurdles to kind of get over with that too? Do you have any anxiety about that, I guess?
As we sit here in late 2023, I don't have any anxiety about it. I think I would have a few years ago. one of the things about the ministry setting that we're in right now is that the people, it's the most biblically literate group of people I've ever been around.
Yes. Same.
And it's also the most spiritually hungry as a whole. I've been around incredibly spiritually hungry individuals and groups of people at every place that I've served in ministry, from North Carolina to Tennessee to Arkansas and down to Oklahoma. But I've never been around such a critical mass of spiritually hungry people. It's exciting to teach in that kind of a setting. It's really exciting to teach in a group of people who want to dive into the Word and who want to grow closer with Christ, who want to come to a greater understanding of the power and presence of the Holy Spirit. There are certain things I don't want to be kind of too kind of trite when I say this, but there are certain things about formal theological education that aren't a lot of fun. Grading papers, not a lot of fun. Attending the kind of meetings you constantly have to attend, the kind of what they would call institutional service, the things that you're doing to serve the institution. A lot of times those are things that exist within formal institutions of theological education because of the particular structure that those institutions end up taking on. And if you were setting out to create a school of ministry from the ground up, a lot of those components you would just never include. They're like barnacles that have attached themselves to the hull of the ship of theological education over the course of decades, really the past 100 to 150 years in this country, that you would never include if you were just cutting it out of whole cloth. I mean, I'm mixing my metaphors a little bit there. And so if you think about, if you were in a local church setting and you wanted to start to create a forum for theological education, a school of ministry, you can include the things that are really helpful to include, and you don't have to include the things you don't want to include. And there's no anxiety in that, because who are you trying to please? Who are you trying to please?
Right. Yeah.
And so just last night, I finished up teaching a class on biblical prophecy, and they were joking with me about halfway through. This was a semester-long course. Mm-hmm. We started it back at the beginning of September. Here we are, right on the cusp of Thanksgiving. So we've been at it for over 2.5 months. And they were teasing me the last couple of weeks of the class about, is there going to be an exam at the end? And there wasn't an exam at the end. But we had been teaching on biblical prophecy. We've been in the Old Testament, the New Testament. We had been reading a wonderful little book by Kim Moss called Prophetic Community. And at the end of it, instead of an exam, what we did was what Kim Moss calls a prophetic activation exercise. And so we took the last half of class and we just stopped and we started praying. We started asking for the Spirit of God to descend upon the room, for the Lord Jesus to be present amongst us. And we asked for the gift of prophecy. And we started, I won't go into too much detail on it. I don't want to get lost in the weeds, but we started doing the kinds of things that would help to make us more comfortable and familiar with what it means to ask for prophetic giftings and to operate in the prophetic. But that kind of thing is incredibly exciting to me. And when I think about how a school for ministry could begin to tie together a lot of the things that we're doing in terms of spiritual formation, in terms of really biblical education, in terms of equipping for evangelism and mission. All of these things could be caught up under the umbrella of a school like that in a way that could be very effective for the work of the kingdom.
Well, and we're talking about theological education here, but I think one of the pieces of the conversation that we've been having for months now is it's kind of education as a whole, is it not? It's not just theological education. It's the schools that our kids are going to.
Yeah.
And just kind of, I'm not even talking about the controversial stuff. I'm just talking about the ability of kids to thrive in those types of environments these days can be pretty difficult. And, we haven't delved much into it, but there's a book sitting here on the table that kind of talks about the role the church has played in educating the masses all throughout history.
Yeah.
And then somewhere along the line, like you said, the past 100, 150 years, the church just went, nah, we're just not going to do that. And, and it's just we're kind of reaping the fruit of that the church has, removed itself from that conversation in any sort of real tangible way. And I think maybe it's time that the church reclaims that and says no, we actually have a voice in the education of the masses. And that voice is going to be theological in nature because we're a church. But it's also open to anyone of any age, potentially, there's some real excitement in that, and what that could look like, and what it might look like for the church to re-engage in those types of conversations.
Yeah. So I did doctoral work about 15 years ago, started almost 20 years ago and finished about 15 years ago. And as a part of that, it was a Doctor of Theology degree program at Duke University through the Divinity School there. And there was a THD seminar that all first-year students were required to take. And part of it was, it was a number of things, the nature of practical theology, and then also the nature of theological education. And we read a book by a theologian named Edward Farley, called Theologia, which was a history of the development of formal theological education. And it started with the cathedral schools back in the early to high Middle Ages. And then, of course, around 1100, 1200, you start to get formal universities that develop out of that. So the University of Paris, Oxford University, Cambridge University, which I think was formed because a lot of the faculty at Oxford got mad and they decamped to Cambridge and formed their own university. So you end up with two universities in England. And then that started happening all over Europe. And when that happened, it was still, for hundreds and hundreds of years, the people that were teaching in those universities were still monks. They were still, that's what they were. They were monks. But it started a process because of the nature of them, because the universities were themselves endowed institutions, collections of colleges, separate from the large cathedrals. You started to have a separation. So the church and university education started to go on these different paths. And then when it really ramps up, of course, is during the Enlightenment, because during the Enlightenment, you start to get the idea that religion is not a help to education, but it's rather a hindrance. And that's where the break really happens in the 18th century and then into the 19th century. And you look at the United States, the context of the United States, and here we never had a theological education that was intimately, not in the main. There would be, not in what you would call mainline religion, did we ever have theological education that was united with the church itself. And I remember studying this as a first-year doctoral student back in 2006 and thinking, we're looking at something and we're trying to, my entire degree program was an attempt, my doctoral program was not run through the graduate school at Duke. It was run through the Divinity School. So and I was in the first year of that program ever. Okay. So I was in the first year class of the first year of the THD program at Duke. And the whole idea was to try to claw back theological education into an ecclesial institution, which is the Divinity School. But even then, as we were going through that process, I remember thinking, but the master of this Divinity School is not the church ultimately. The master is the university. The people that come to teach here are not trying to get tenure from the church. They're trying to get tenure from the university. And that means that the publications that they're producing are not meant to be utilized for formational purposes in the church. They're meant to be utilized by academic scholars in the American Academy of Religion or the Society of Biblical Literature. It doesn't mean that those scholars didn't write books for the church. Some of them did, and some of them were very good, but they weren't the books that got them tenure, and therefore they weren't the works that they were primarily occupied or committed to working on. If you write a book for the church, that's something you do in your spare time. The things that you write in order to get tenure are journal articles in peer-reviewed journals and books published by university presses that a very small handful of people are going to read. And so for me, the question becomes, is it not inevitable that the church over the course of generations suffers when those who are training pastors for the church are not themselves beholden ultimately to the church? What are your thoughts, Matthew?
I actually thought earlier when you said that your biblical prophecy class was wondering if there was a final exam. That's how our mindset is shaped.
Yeah.
When there actually is a final exam and it's them going out and asking God for a word for somebody.
Yes. Yeah.
What we're trying to do isn't so much did I get an A on an exam, but did Christ live in me? And did I make an impact on someone's life for the kingdom of God? That's the exam.
Yeah.
And that goes back to what I said earlier. I just think the purpose of what we're thinking about in terms of school for ministry, the purpose is different and the outcomes are different. And, maybe in a larger sense, theological education, can or even wants to come back to that at some point. There's got to be some shifts that happen. I mean, when you look at seminaries in the United States in particular, almost all of them are bleeding students compared to where they were 20 years ago.
They are, yeah.
And so I think there needs to be some serious, questions about what we're actually doing. Are we trying to stay accredited with ATS? Or are we trying to? I went to a seminary that's still doing pretty well in terms of student enrollment and stuff like that, Asbury Theological Seminary. And their purpose is the whole Bible for the whole world. They're trying to train people to take the witness in the Scriptures into the whole world.
Yeah.
And that's a purpose I can get behind. Are we equipping students to actually do that without some of the baggage of, dare I say, institutionalism?
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say this, I think Asbury is going to be around for a very long time. And I think there's a handful of standalone seminaries that will. I think that university-based theological schools, and I mentioned my alma mater, Duke Divinity School, I think they will be around because they're propped up by the universities of which they're a part. But I think that they will look less and less like seminaries and more like, a school of religion, a graduate school of religion. And there, the question is, who's going to attend and for what reason? I don't know if you've ever taken a class in like a religious studies department, but it can be soul crushing, when you treat your coursework as if it's some form of sociology or anthropology, and there's no truth to it really. It's just a form of social science. Most standalone seminaries are not going to be as healthy as a place like Asbury is. Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of them at a liberal arts college and one of them a seminary, and then both of them I worked at. So my first academic job, so to speak, was right after my master's degree, and I got a job as an associate chaplain at a school called Lambeth University in Jackson, Tennessee. Well, that school doesn't exist anymore. It couldn't survive the financial crisis, and they ended up having to essentially close their doors, and they sold the property to the University of Memphis, and it's now a branch campus of the University of Memphis. So that's the first place I worked at. The second place I worked at was after I got out of my doctoral program, and I got hired by Memphis Theological Seminary. That's where I taught on the faculty for 4 years. It's a standalone Cumberland Presbyterian Seminary. I'm still on their mailing list. And the most recent emails that we've gotten from their president, who's a great guy, he's a wonderful guy, but they've announced that they're exploring the possibility of merging with a larger institution because they just financially they can't stay open. So there are kind of titanic shifts that are happening in higher education right now. The internet has changed an awful lot. Schools have not been able to keep their costs under control, and a lot of people are questioning the value of going into $100,000 in debt for a degree that's not really worth it, and the question is, what is going to come to take its place? What's going to come to fill the vacuum?
Yeah, that last part was exactly what I was thinking about. I'm 46 years old and I'm still paying my student loans from seminary, and so you give someone a choice. Do you want to come and be equipped to do ministry in whatever context you're in, whether you're going to be the pastor of a church or whether you're a CPA who loves Jesus and wants to be a witness to Christ wherever you are? Do you want to go $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 in debt possibly to get an MDiv, or do you want to come here and get trained and equipped for, I don't know that we've ever talked about what this might cost a student or anything, but it'd be considerably less. And man, I can already feel the heat I'm going to get from some of my theological school friends. But I think I'd want my daughter just to go get equipped. Even if she's teaching English in a high school, to go through a school of ministry like what we're planning on doing, or even if she was going to be a worship leader somewhere.
Yeah, so I think like one of the main objections that one of Matthew's theological education friends would probably have, it might be like, okay, if we're doing something like this in a church, and let's say that's here, or it could just be anywhere. Just a church is doing this. It's like, well, yeah, but you don't have, where are you getting your faculty, right? Like, where are you getting all the people with the letters in the front and the end of their names? Like, do you think, having been in that world, Andrew, like, is there, I mean, we need scholars.
Yeah.
So it's not a dig on academia, but like, is there that much of a drop in usefulness of the content and the experience going from somebody that might have a PhD in whatever to living something out for a semester in a church context and kind of learning it there? Like, what's the difference, you think, between those, and is there a value to the latter as opposed to the former, or do you think, what's the kind of the give and take in that?
I think that's the rub. I think you have put your finger on the rub, because you still need people to study Greek and Hebrew.
Right.
And you still need people to be conversant in the history of the church over the past 2,000 years. You still need people to understand the major approaches to Christian ethics and how to adjudicate those and how to teach those. I mean, and it goes on and on and on, right? With every subdiscipline under the heading of theological studies. And so do you have to have people that have gone through the secularizing and secularized graduate programs in religion in order to get that credentialing? Or are you able to make a cathedral school model form of theological education robust enough to be able to reproduce itself?
Right.
And I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
But think about, okay, let's say that you had a connection of churches that were in the Wesleyan tradition and that were evangelical in their approach to the word and charismatic in their spirituality. And they were spread across a large enough geographical area where they had joined together in a kind of a movement, that they believed that God was leading them into some kind of a movement. And they needed to staff their own churches as over the course of time, as people were led to go different places, or you had to replace pastors. And they also believed strongly in a calling to plant churches. Would that connection of churches have the ability to come together and, using a cathedral school model, train up from within those who were called to ministry, to then turn around and to deploy them out into the ministry field and the mission field? I mean, that for me, that's the question.
I mean, that's not unheard of, considering that some of the greatest thinkers in Christian history literally were formed in the church and were brought up. You know what I mean? So it's like, that obviously can be the case again.
Yeah.
I think it would just take a church being intentional enough, or maybe a network of churches being intentional enough and open enough to do that.
Does it need to be the case again? Is it in order for the church to experience renewed vitality, does the new wine need to truly be put in a new wineskin, as opposed to trying to force new wine into a wineskin that still seems to carry too much of the old?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, what kind of church do you want to persist into the future? Do you want one that's flexible and agile enough to minister to a changing world that is changing faster than anybody can keep up with? Or do you want one that looks a lot like mainline churches in the 1950s?
Right.
And it's like, to be agile and to be flexible enough to minister to the needs of the world today. I mean, I don't think I'm going on too far on a limb to say we're going to have to do some stuff different. Like, we can't just keep doing the same things that we're doing and expecting it to all of a sudden get better. It's the thing, like, we kind of been joking. It's like, you can't just go like, oh, we're going to keep the same system, but this time we're going to do it the right way.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, sometimes it's not the people in the system. Sometimes it really is just the system.
Yeah.
You can have the best people in the world, but the system is actually what the limitation is. And when I say system, I mean kind of structures and norms and forms.
I understand.
But sometimes that's the thing that's holding you back. Like, the fact that we couldn't even really conceive of this in any sort of serious way until this year, because of the system that we were previously in. It's almost subconscious. You're just not allowed to think about it, and you don't give yourself permission to think about it. But when it's all on the line, like it is with us here working together, and it's like, you start thinking down the line 20, 30 years, God willing, where's our next pastor come from? And it's like, well, what if it's up to us to raise them up?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not unheard of in the scope of church history.
It's not unheard of in the scope of church history. It's not unheard of in contemporary spirituality in America, or contemporary churches in America.
That's fair.
It is relatively unheard of amongst Wesleyan churches. And I think that's part of what we're dancing around here, because it feels unfamiliar for us, because when you look at historic Methodist churches, that does not tend to be the way that they've done it. But here's the thing. I don't mind trying and failing in this work that we're all trying to do for Jesus. And I don't just mean the three of us. I mean all of us. In this work that we're trying to do for Jesus and that we believe that he's called us to do. At the end of the day, I think it's okay if we try and fail. I just don't want to try and fail for lack of creativity, you know?
Yeah, 100%. I'm on board with that agenda. What's the worst that could happen? Some people are going to get are going to get trained in the scriptures and like how to share the gospel and stuff like that. Oh, yeah, that's terrible.
Yeah.
Well, I think I've said before, like I played sports growing up, and I was really good at the sports where you ran into stuff. I wasn't great at things that required hand-eye coordination or agility in any way. But I did play baseball. I was pretty horrific. And the only encouragement I always got from my baseball coach was every time I struck out, I always struck out swinging.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, at least that's a mark in my favor, I guess. And I guess I feel about that the same way. It's like one of these days, ministry is going to end for all of them. And so do I want to go out swinging on something that like, yeah, man, I don't know that we can do it. I don't know. I don't even really know what we're doing. It's such a big idea. It's so outside of my wheelhouse, but we feel like we're being stirred to move it. Do we want to go out trying to do that? Or do we want to go out doing the thing that we've always been doing because we know how to do it?
Right.
And it's like, man, I think the thing that's really stirring in me is like, man, I get one shot at this thing called life, and a life of ministry especially. I get one shot at it. And I don't want it to end having just kind of been comfortable and doing the same thing I've always been doing.
Yeah. There's something about it that changes when you get in your 40s. Like you start to get a greater perspective with age. And when you're in your 20s, you barely even realize you're an adult. You're in your 30s and you still feel like you're at a junior level in your profession. I think it's probably in any profession. You're still looking up at people that are older, more accomplished, and have the positions that you're aspiring to. And then you get in your 40s and you're like, oh, it's half over. Mm-hmm. Like it's halfway over. Like life is halfway over. Career is halfway over. You're at if your career and your life is like up a hill and then down the other side, you're at the top of the hill and you have a great perspective on where you've come from. You can turn around and look, but you can also see the end. You can also see the bottom of the hill. And suddenly time, I think, takes on a really different kind of a sense. You talk about striking out swinging, and I've heard you use that image before, and I like to think in my mind of little Todd Lovell up at the plate, just taking his hacks, taking his hacks.
I've never been little,
but the image for me is also an image from childhood, and for me, it's where I learned to swim. I learned to swim at the swimming pool in my hometown of Paragould, and back in the 80s, it still had a high dive. When insurance companies still let the swimming pools have high dives. There was a high dive and a low dive. And I remember the first couple of years jumping off the low dive and looking over at the high dive and the kids that were jumping off, doing cannonballs, the ones that were really brave, actually diving off of it, and it seemed impossibly high. And then there came that summer where I said to myself, I'm jumping off of that high dive. And the thing about the diving board was that there was always a line of kids like to get up it. And they were all, I don't know why the lifeguards let them do this, but it wasn't like the kids were like ants on the ladder, So the kid behind you was ready to step onto the board. He's at the top of the ladder, ready to step on the board. And you would get up to the top and you had to go and you had to jump off. And if you didn't jump off, you had to go through this humiliating process of going back to the end and making all the kids climb off the ladder so you could get down. So there's this enormous amount of pressure, right? But you get up there for the first time and you're up there and it's probably 10 feet off the water, but it seems impossibly high. It's impossibly high when you're up there and you get to the end of the board. And at a certain point, you finally just have to close your eyes and jump. And here's the thing. When we get to the end of this thing, I don't want to have been to the top of the high dive and walk back to the ladder and ask them to get off the ladder so I can climb down. Yeah. I want to jump. And I'm not even sure what jumping looks like yet. But when it comes to that point, that's what I want to do.
My wife reminds me that a lot of my really good friends have letters after their names. And I realize it's kind of a weird situation to be in when nearly your closest friend group, everybody's got a PhD or a THD or a D-Med or something like that. It's the way it is.
Including you.
Well, so I realized that if our friends listen to this, how scary the idea of this might be. But I think what you have said is exactly right. I mean, we are at a culture shift, a paradigm shift in the church, in our country, and in the world. And one of the things that I've learned since we've talked about like this year, things that we're thankful for and the shifts that we have made, that it may look scary to think about, talk about trying some of these things, but the possibilities are exciting and we're not limited. And I think that's the thing I want to remember, because I felt like there were limits. There's not. We can do things to do exactly what we want to do, which is to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that Jesus commanded, because he is with us. And if he's with us, we can't lose.
That is the absolute truth. That is the absolute truth. Well, we set about to do a podcast episode on Thanksgiving, and we ended up talking about theological education the whole time. But it was a good conversation. Well, that's about all the time that we have today on Spirit, Power, and Grace. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, or your podcast provider of choice. Our audio engineer is Miguel Figueredo. The podcast is edited by Kyle Westfall. We'd love for you to help us spread the word and continue to grow our listener base. So please like, share, and subscribe. I want to say a special thanks to my guests, Matthew Johnson and Todd Lovell. Until next time, this is Andrew Thompson for Spirit, Power, and Grace.